I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello again. Welcome to another pre-election edition of TGU from VLGA Connect, sponsored by Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. This week, we're going back just a few months to a conversation I had with Jonathan Carr-West. He's the Chief Executive of the Local Government Information Unit in the United Kingdom. It was pre-election there at the time, and we discussed the findings from a financial sustainability of local government report in the UK and the parallels with the Victorian sector, which is what we wanted to check in with you on. You've released a pretty wide-ranging survey that you've conducted around the sector over there. Tell us about the survey, firstly. Who have you talked to and what about?
Right. So this is a survey we do every year on the state of local government finance, and it's a survey that goes out to every council chief exec, every council leader, the equivalent of mayors in an Australian context, every cabinet member so that's the councillor responsible for finance, and every chief finance officer in every council in England. And we always get a pretty good response. So this year we had, I think, 160 responses from 128 councils. So that's nearly half the councils in the country responding. It's a pretty good response rate. So the survey is pretty authoritative, pretty definitive. We've been doing it for a decade now. We had a break in COVID year, but we're doing it for a decade. So we've got quite good data over time of the state of English local government finance. And what we try and do with this survey is kind of get behind the scenes a bit, because obviously there's lots of data, retrospective data available about what actually happened, what councils' budgets really were, what the sort of reductions in spending were. What we do is try and get in ahead of councils setting their budgets at around this time of year, and say, look, how does this feel to you? What's it looking like? What's the risk? What do you think is going to happen? And for 10 years, that has been a progressively grim picture. And, Australian listeners with an interest in English local government will know that there's been a very tight austerity squeeze on English local government finances for over a decade now, since 2011. And indeed, back in 2017, I was invited over to Australia to sort of tell us how bad it is there and what can we learn. And it's only got worse since then. This year, we see it really, really dropping off a cliff.
So Jonathan, it seems every day I wake up and see the news feeds, and there's another council declaring a Section 114, which means effective bankruptcy. There's commissioners being appointed. I think Nottingham this week, as we record this, has just had commissioners announced. Yep. Seeing as you've been doing the survey for so long, you say the picture's been getting more grim each year, but did you really see a crisis of this extreme coming?
Well, look, I don't want to sort of be all I told you, but yes, we did.
Yeah.
We have been, and we're not alone. Other bodies in the sector as well. We have been warning of this for years. So, this time last year, about 8% of councils, so nearly 1 in 10, were saying, look, we're worried that we might not be able to balance our books this year, that we might issue it. And actually, that is pretty much what's happened. We've seen, as you say, this steady sort of drip of councils effectively going bankrupt, including now big high-profile councils. Birmingham, the biggest local authority in Europe, Nottingham, a major city. These are not small or insignificant places. These are big mainstream councils going bust. Just before Christmas, the Local Government Association looked at their members, and 1 in 10 are warning now that they might go bust this year. We're getting the same figure from our survey, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, Chris. So what we did, and the big finding from this survey, is we said, okay, everyone's asking about the next year. What if we ask about the next 5 years? We're coming up to an election in the UK. There'll be a national election this year. We don't know when, maybe in May, maybe in the autumn. But we will have a new government. So we asked about a 5-year horizon. That's the parliamentary term for the next government. When you ask about a 5-year horizon, what happens if nothing changes over 5 years? Half the councils in the country say they will go bust within the next 5 years if nothing changes.
That's staggering. That is just staggering, isn't it? Oh, you were talking about the big councils having issues like your Birminghams and Nottinghams, etc. How are the little councils coping in this environment?
So it plays out in different ways, and one of the challenges in explaining English local government to any other audience is just how mixed and varied it is. So you have councils of very different types, and different types of councils have different responsibilities. What that means is they feel pressure in different ways. So the main difference is between what we call unitary or upper tier councils, which have responsibility, and this is different from the Australian context. They have responsibility for social care. So caring for older people, caring for working age people with disabilities, and they have responsibility for children's services. So that's protection of vulnerable children, child protection services, but it's also support for children with special educational needs. Now, those two, for upper tier councils, it's those two cost pressures that are really creating this crisis.
Right.
We've seen demand and cost rocket in both of those areas. So children's services clearly identified as the biggest immediate cost, adult services identified as the biggest long-term cost. Lower tier councils don't deal with those two things. And by the way, I should say that if you are a council that has those responsibilities, you are spending on average about 70% of your budget, 70% of your budget on those two service areas.
Staggering.
Which we can come back to the consequences of that. For lower tier councils, they don't have those responsibilities. For district councils, which tend to be smaller, are smaller and tend to be more rural, but they do have responsibility for housing and homelessness. And that too is an area where we're seeing massive cost increases and demand increases, particularly post-COVID. So they feel it in different ways, but councils of all types, big and small, are under pressure. And councils of all types, big and small, rural and urban, have seen the similar level of income reduction over the last 15 years. So it looks slightly different, but the pressure, the level of crisis and pressure is very similar. You talked about 114s, Chris. We've seen 114 in Birmingham and Nottingham. Those are major cities, but we've also seen them in Woking, a small council that went bust with £2 billion worth of liabilities, billion with a B. We've seen this in Thurrock, a small council that went bust with massive debts. In Slough, a small. So those 114 notices, there have been 8, and they include both small councils and big councils, Conservative councils and Labour councils, semi-rural councils and city councils. So it is a problem that is affecting the whole sector.
So, Jonathan, given that, you've mentioned the austerity issue, you've mentioned the cost of social care and how that's rising and creating a lot of pressure. You'd be forgiven, though, if you just looked at some of the media reports for thinking that councils have caused this themselves by making bad decisions, bad investments, etc. That sounds like that's in the minority of cases. Is that right?
I think that is right. I mean, look, you've got nearly 400 councils across England. Inevitably, some will make better decisions than others. That's the point of local government. People make different decisions in different places. Now, it is, what central government has been really keen to do, as you say, is to point the finger and say, these are bad councils that made bad choices. There's not a systematic funding problem here. I think that's a false binary, right? If you have a system-wide problem, then almost inevitably, the places that fall over first will be the ones who made the poorest choices, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a system problem. Now, of course, we should look at the governance and the decisions that were made in places like Birmingham that led to this. And no one, including the leadership of Birmingham, is claiming that there weren't bad decisions made. But what we see in this survey is that it's not just councils that have made bad decisions that are facing this. When you're looking at half the councils in the country saying we are frightened that over the next 5 years we will go bankrupt, you can't have a system in which you say only people who never make a bad decision, only perfect councils can survive. You can't say half the councils in the country are poorly run. The government has politicized this, but we've also seen big, and this is on the record, so the Conservative county councils like Kent and Hampshire wrote to the Secretary of State last year saying, if you don't give us more money, we will go bust by 2026. The government's not going to turn around and say, look, Kent has been Conservative run forever. That's a bad council. It's bad. It's not. You can't. So yes, some of the councils that fell over first, and one chief exec said this to me. He said, look, make no mistake, we are all on this pathway. Some people are closer to the cliff, some are further back, but we are all heading in the same direction. So the councils that fell over first, of course, we can and we should learn lessons and question what the decisions that were made there. But we mustn't allow that to fool us into thinking that there isn't a deep systemic problem where, basically in very simple terms, councils do not have enough money to deliver the services that they are required by law to deliver.
So I'm interested, perhaps in a moment, to come to the central government's role in this and how it's responded, because there's some interesting stuff in there. But firstly, how are councils, aside from any central government assistance, how are they dealing with these issues? Because we're seeing reports about lights being dimmed at night and women's safety groups expressing concerns and job cuts, etc. How widespread are those sort of cuts happening across the sector?
They're incredibly widespread. So look, we go back to the central point that people need to understand, and that people, that the general public, I think, in the UK don't understand. 70% of the money goes on on adult social care and children's services. So you can talk all you like about closing, reducing library hours or dimming street lights or stopping there's a joke in the English local government that we're rewilding, which means we're not cutting the grass anymore because we can't.
Yes.
But actually, all that stuff is pretty marginal, because the big cost areas are in those statutory duties around care and children's services, where councils have very little capacity to control the costs for reasons we could discuss. So yes, what we're seeing is councils across the country making cuts to services, and the things that they are all making cuts to are those, inevitably the deepest cuts in those discretionary services, parks, libraries. Libraries is a statutory service, but the level of provision is not set. Business support, culture, all of those things are being slashed to the bone. We also see councils across the country putting up council tax. So that's their equivalent of rates, domestic rates. They're only allowed by law to put that up by 4.99%. If they want to put it up more, they have to hold a local referendum, which people have historically not been keen to do, on the basis that it's unlikely that people will vote for higher taxes. But effectively every council in the country, bar literally one or two, is putting up council tax, and they're all putting it up by the maximum they can. We also know that more than half the councils in the country are digging into their reserves year after year after year. So it's the definition of unsustainability.
So, Jonathan, given that, as you've said, really councils only have capacity to make those sort of changes in those discretionary areas, the areas that they're not obliged in a statutory sense to deliver, how are communities responding to this? And does your survey tell you much about how councils and communities are engaging on the problem?
No, we're going to be, but just to sort of preempt that, I'm not saying, by the way, that they are not making cuts in those statutory provisions. They are reducing those as much as they can. So, but there's not much scope to do it. So 16% of councils told us, yes, we're making cuts to adult social care, but they're relatively limited because, the eligibility criteria are set out and the market doesn't allow. So children's services, for example, children's residential care is incredibly expensive. You have private sector operators, you've got a lot of private equity money in it now. They're charging astronomical fees, and councils are pretty much held over a barrel. So talking to a director of children's services, saying, look, if you have a child who is in an unsafe environment, you have determined through difficult processes, and you don't take this decision lightly, that child needs to be removed and taken to a safe place. That needs to happen now, today, tonight, and you need to use, and the provider who has a space is the provider that you use, and you don't have the luxury of saying, oh, I think there's a bit too much profit margin on their fees, we'll go with someone else, because you have a child at risk. You have to act. So in that sort of environment, and you have, which is a moral duty, but also a legal duty, in that sort of environment, your capacity to control that cost is much more limited than you would like. So it is really hard in an environment where more and more children are ending up at risk, in an environment where more and more children are requiring special educational needs support. It's very, you can talk about councils being efficient and you can demand productivity plans, as the government has done, which perhaps we'll talk about.
Yes.
But actually, the capacity to reduce that burden is really limited.
Mm.
On the point about the community, we don't know that yet. And in fact, we have another piece of work planned for just ahead of the local elections in May. We're going to be doing a bit of work with Ipsos Mori, some public polling, because I think the question that this raises, so councils in this survey telling us, yeah, sure, we're making cuts, and we think we're making cuts to frontline services, and we think people are going to notice. These are the things. Most people, the challenge here is that most people, those core statutory duties, if you don't have a child with special educational needs, if you don't have a relative in care, you don't really notice that. So you pay your council tax and you don't really see where most of it's going, because all that's invisible. It's happening behind closed doors. The stuff that people do see, the streetlights, the libraries, the parks, the swimming pools, that's the stuff that's being slashed to the bone. So ahead of local elections, we're going to do some public polling, with a representative sample saying, do people notice that? My hypothesis is that they do. But if so, who do they blame? Do they think, oh, that's the council's fault? Or are people starting to say, hang on, what's the council meant to do? It hasn't got any money. That we don't know yet. I think that is a really important question politically, because for the last 15 years, 14 years, effectively, the government has done this kind of sleight of hand where it's shifted the financial and the political risk onto local councils, thinking that, well, people will see this deterioration in their neighborhood, but they won't blame us, they'll blame the council. I would like to think that at some point that sort of political gambit runs out of road, but that needs testing.
So it'll be good to talk again when you have that data. Again, just putting the government to one side for a moment, I'll come to that in a second. When we're talking about cuts, how much are we seeing in terms of job losses in the local government sector at the moment?
Well, we're starting to see huge job losses. So to give you an example, Somerset County Council was in the news the other day because they've announced, so they haven't issued a 114, though they have said they are close to it, and that they will be in that situation unless they are able to save a lot of money, and unless they get an injection of cash from the government. They're talking about 1,300 job losses.
Wow.
Probably out of, I don't know what their total employee numbers would be, but it would be 5,000-6,000, something like that. So
it's a significant number, isn't it? Yeah.
Significant.
Yeah.
In Birmingham, where they've sent commissioners in. I mean, so it's worth dwelling. Sorry stop me, Chris, if I rant too much about this.
No,
but
you're fine.
On what this means, right? So Birmingham has issued a 114. They have sent in commissioners. Commissioners are sent in to run the council directly for the government. And the idea is that they make tough choices because they're not, they don't have to worry about being voted for. But let's look at what's happening in Birmingham. They've got permission from the government to raise council tax by 21% over the next 2 years, right? So I've said that normally the maximum you can raise is
4.99. Yeah.
20. They are selling off over 300 million pounds worth of public assets. And one of the things that they do when councils issue 114s is the government does what's called a capitalisation directive, which means that the council can spend capital revenue on revenue budgets. But the quid pro quo is they have to sell off assets. So effectively, you're seeing a fire sale of assets. So loads of things that used to be owned by Birmingham Council, by the public, will now be owned by presumably private equity firms, private sector. So mass transfer of assets from the public to the private. Children's services. We talked about the rising demand in children's services. Birmingham are having to make 24% cuts in their children's services budget. What's that going to mean? There aren't going to be suddenly 25% less children who in need. There aren't going to be you're storing up huge problems. I mean, this is the challenge, that in the sort of race to the sort of drastic action to close that budget deficit, you're making decisions that are going to have a huge long-term cost. What will those children, I mean, even if you're not thinking about it in terms of people's lives and people's well-being, just thinking about it in pounds and pence, those children from whom we are now withdrawing support, what are they going to end up costing when they're young adults? When they're adults, yeah, they're going to require more support, more intervention from the states. They're more likely to end up, so if we cut support for sort of, anti-gang activity, you're going to have more kids in gangs. You cut support for early years support, you have more children who require intervention when they're older. So it's all, the risk is that it's all a massively false economy as we take these really drastic actions. The immediate risk is that the people of Birmingham are paying a whole chunk more tax, which they can't afford because we're in a cost of living crisis, and they're getting a whole lot less for it. So it's a really, really terrible sort of vicious circle of decline.
It really is. And that's just one council. And I get that it's the biggest, but replicate that across a whole host of other councils, and you've got a devastating impact in total, haven't you?
Exactly. And this is where I think our survey this year sort of opens up this debate in a different way, because we've asked the 5-year question. So over the next parliamentary term, and you're half of council. So still, at the moment, still, central government can sort of deal with this council by council. It's that council. It's the council's problem. If over the term of the next government, up to half the councils in the country could go bust, that's government's problem. That's not something you can deal with one by one, saying, oh, that's them, we'll put it in special measures. You're going to need system reform, because otherwise you risk the sort of level of collapse that I've just been sort of talking about. You sort of risk that across half the country. And I mean, that's devastating. And that, this is a funny form of optimism, but my sort of, where I feel optimistic in that is that I hope not too naively, still think that is so unthinkable that when a government is finally realizes that it's looking down the barrel of this, they will have to act, because you can't just abandon vulnerable older people in half the country. You can't just abandon children in half the country. So I think, we are reaching a point at which action will have to be taken. Our argument would be that it would be more cost effective and better for everyone concerned to take that action first, to get in ahead of it, to reform how councils are funded, so that we see this off before the worst happens. But one way or another, something will have to change.
Let's talk about what the government's doing now. Michael Gove, correct, is the Secretary of State. He's recently announced a funding package tied to productivity plans that councils have to produce to receive that money. Have I got that right? And how has that been received?
You have, although, the funding was announced first, and then they slipped in this, and by the way, yeah. How has it been received? It's a family show, Chris, so it's hard to find words. I mean, the views that have been expressed to me from within the sector are not repeatable in this context. Badly. So look, so first, there's a couple of things here, right? So firstly, the funding settlement comes out. So this is all an example of how badly we do this. Local governments have hobbles along with these 1-year funding settlements from central government. So you can't do effective mid to long-term planning. So we get the funding settlement just before Christmas. So it's really late in the day, right? So councils have to close their budget process by March. And in late December, it's literally 2 or 3 days before Christmas, they bring out the provisional settlement, and then there's a sort of quick consultation on it, and then it's finalized in January. So it's a mad system to start with. So the provisional settlement comes out. As expected, it's not enough money. There's a lot of lobbying, and then the county councils, largely Conservative, did a very effective lobbying job on this. And a bunch of Conservative MPs, about 40 MPs, wrote a letter to the Secretary of State saying, this isn't enough, we're in trouble, for along the lines that we've been talking about. And so an extra 500 million was found. And then an extra 100, so 600 in total. So on one level, great, it's a bit of extra money. But it's not enough. I mean, the LGA, our local government association, calculates a £4 billion funding gap. So
it's just a drop in the bucket.
A billion is not. And secondly, it's also the process. It's like, this is exactly what's wrong with the way we do it in this country. That, well, then suddenly, 40 MPs lobby government, and then government throws us a bone of a bit more extra cash, and it's a surprise. And that's not how a sensible country would fund local government. It's not predictable. It's not, you can't plan on the basis of like, well, I wonder how many MPs will write a letter this year.
Yeah.
It's not a good way of doing it. So you get not enough money delivered in a hokey way, and then you tie onto it this demand for productivity plans. Now, look, productivity in the public sector is a notoriously difficult thing to measure. And I wouldn't pretend enough economic expertise to do that. I mean, productivity, by the way, is a massive problem in the UK. Full stop. We have lower productivity than most comparable nations, and that's been a long-standing problem. In the public sector, it's very difficult to measure. And some of the elements of this productivity plan, no one, by the way, would deny that councils should be as efficient, should be as productive as possible. Some of the elements of this do frankly seem political, seem to be about politics and polarization and populism, not about productivity. So, for example, one of the things that councils are required to report on is how many equalities, diversity, and inclusion officers they're employing. Because Michael Gove doesn't see that as a good use of money. So it's saying, well, we hope you're not employing too many EDI officers. What on earth is this about? That's clearly doesn't, setting aside the fact that actually, those people do useful, good work. Set aside the fact, by the way, that the government requires councils, quite rightly, to do an equalities impact assessment on their activities. So who do they think is going to do that? So you've got a bizarre situation where the government's telling you off for employing the people you need to do the thing the government tells you have to do.
Makes no sense.
It makes no sense, and it's marginal, and it's clearly just a sort of political gesture. So, well, these woke councils wasting their money on equalities officers when they could be spending it on real things. It's farcical.
And did I also see, Jonathan, in there, I think it was tucked away, a comment that there'd be some disincentives coming for those councils that have or are thinking of having 4-day working week arrangements like South Cambridgeshire?
Yes. But again, what is this about? So South Cambridgeshire have done, who we know well, they're one of our members, they're a good council. They did an experiment, a trial with a 4-day working week. They measured the productivity of it. They found that it was a productive way for them to deploy their staff. They got better output, and there are lots of studies of this. Now, so I think that a 4-day week actually works quite well in that sort of organization, but it's not really the point. It doesn't matter what I think. That should be for them to decide. So where's the Secretary of State going to stop? Is he going to tell people, councils, how they should be arranging the shift patterns for their cleaning staff, how they it is an executive decision. It's a decision for that council how they feel they deploy their resources most effectively, for which they are accountable to the people of South Cambridgeshire who elect them. And if the people of South Cambridgeshire think that's a terrible idea, they'll vote for someone else. It just seems to me the ultimate sort of example of this sort of pointless control freakery you're literally starting to interfere with how council staff should work, what hours they should work, what days how does that work? Are you going to get into, every time someone returns from maternity leave, the Secretary of State's going to intervene in the sort of, how many days a week they come back? Oh, we don't want a job share there. We don't want that person working. Where does this
end?
stop?
Yeah. What does the survey tell you? And we're going to need to wrap up, but what does the survey tell you about that relationship between local government and the central government? It doesn't sound like it'd be in a happy place.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, Chris, with no expletives. Look, when we ask people how much confidence they have in the sustainability of local government finance, last year, 14% of people said they were confident in it. This year, that's dropped to 4%. 4% of people in the sector, leaders in the sector, telling us that they're confident. When we ask about what central government has been doing, I mean, you almost can't measure it. So we asked, do you think that are you happy with government's performance in terms of how they consider local government in wider policy decisions? Only 8% are happy. Do you think,
who are those 8%?
We can't, I'm not allowed, great, the team will get very cross if the survey's done anonymously, so we can't. Do you think local government, the central government understands the scale of the problems facing local government financially? 6%. Do you think they're providing enough clarity to allow you to plan your finances? 3.5%. Are you happy with central government's performance in terms of delivering a sustainable funding system? 1.4%.
Gosh,
So
that's
98% of people saying, of course they're not doing a good job on that.
yeah,
So, that tells you something.
it's deplorable, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you were to look at the sort of, we've got a few text box in there, and some of the comments are
Not fit for repeating.
Not fit for repeating.
Yeah.
I mean, but people are just saying, look, you get comments like, we're doomed, we're in a death spiral. This is, and they don't understand, and they're not engaging with us, and they're not listening with us to us. And the sort of final word on this that came from one of our respondents, who just said, look, it's not rocket science. Listen to what local government's telling you. Understand the scale of the problem. Work with us to resolve the situation. Local government has ideas about the things that could help. Multi-year financial settlements, ending competitive bid funding, going back to a needs-based funding assessment. Just in the short term, those three things, which we're hopeful that the next government will commit to, and if it's a Labour government, they do look like they're committing to those things. Those don't fix the problem, but they at least give us some clarity and a bit of stability that allows us to then think about the longer term reform that we might need. So at the moment, the situation is dire. People are very unhappy with the performance. I mean, the number of people happy with government's performance in funding councils is negligible. It's less than 2%.
So you've used words like doom and death spiral and dire. Just to wrap it up, is there anything in this that gives you some sense of confidence or positivity that the sector will find its way out of these troubles anytime soon?
I think we have. I mean, I'm hesitant to end on a down, but I think we are. Councils have spent in the UK have spent the last 15 years nearly stretching themselves ever thinner, doing a remarkable, unheralded, unthanked job at keeping local services going in a catastrophic financial situation. But that elastic can only stretch so far, and I think we are getting to the end of the road in terms of council's ability to keep finding innovative ways to keep the show going. We're reaching the point where we need national government to understand the scale of this problem and to do something about it. Now, that something isn't about just funneling massive injections of cash into local government, but it is about giving us a system that is predictable, that so councils can cut their cloth to suit their means. It's about giving us a system that enables us to join up services in a way that enables prevention, that enables us to invest, to save, that enables us to do the things that reduce pressure on acute services and bring that money back into local authorities to fund prevention. So there are things you could do, and it's time we did them.
I did try to drag something positive out to end on, but I've been unsuccessful there. But look, you paint a worrisome picture, but that's the state that the sector's in. And I really do appreciate you walking us through those findings, Jonathan, and it would be good to keep in touch as the situation develops in the coming months.
For sure. Very, happy to come back anytime and tell you about that, what the public think. I think that's going to be a really important finding.
Jonathan Carr-West, CEO of LGIU, thank you very much for your time. Well, very interesting to reflect on the experience there in the UK and the similarities with our sector here in Australia and more locally in Victoria. Do you think we're headed down the same path? Certainly financial sustainability is a hot issue here, and we've had parliamentary inquiries looking into that. Of course, should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the sustainability of the sector? I'm sure there'll be more discussion on that in the weeks ahead and as we move into a new term here in Victoria. That's the last of our Look Back episodes for pre-election TGU. We'll be back with more very soon. I hope you can join us then. Thanks to VLGA Connect and our sponsors, Hunt and Hunt Lawyers.